Our story begins in the 6th century BC, and not, you might be surprised to hear, in Greece. The first ancient philosophy was written in Greek, but in the territory called Ionia, on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. You would reach it if you started in Greece and went around or across the Aegean Sea towards the east, which is exactly what Greek-speaking peoples had done well before the 6th century before Christ. The ancient Greek historians tell us that in about 1100 before Christ, in response to an invasion of mainland Greece by a people they called the Dorians, many inhabitants of mainland Greece crossed over to Ionia. That name, Ionia, comes from a legendary leader of the colonists, Ion. These refugees set up a number of colonies, some of which became extremely successful. One of the earliest colonies was Miletus, the city Thales called his home. It was founded by a group who came from around Athens, the future home of Plato and Aristotle, and one of the few places in mainland Greece not to fall to the Dorians. At least, that's what the ancient historians tell us, and the claim is supported by similarities between the Ionian dialect and the dialect they spoke near Athens called Attic Greek, Attica being the area surrounding Athens. Miletus was a rich and successful city. Just like Australia in the 19th century, Miletus went from colony to independent economic power on the back of sheep. Their wool was exported across the Mediterranean. Miletus and other Ionian cities became wealthy enough to found colonies of their own as far away as Italy, but also around the Black Sea, which was an area of strength for the Milesians in particular. Miletus was fairly far south in Ionia, and their location and success as traders meant that someone living in Miletus could easily be exposed to ideas and people from further inland to the east and from Egypt. So it's always been tempting to say that Thales and the other Milesian thinkers got some of their ideas from Eastern or Egyptian traditions. For instance, Thales was famous for having predicted a solar eclipse in 585 before Christ, and if he really did that, he may have been using Babylonian astronomical tables to pull off the trick. There's also some evidence that Thales went to Egypt in person. Miletus, then, was a good place to be in the early 6th century before Christ if you wanted to become the first ever philosopher. But even Miletus wasn't the sort of town where you could just relax and gaze at the stars, trying to figure out when the next eclipse might be coming along. It would be a while before a Greek author would describe full-time contemplation as anything like an ideal or desirable life. On this point, Aristotle makes particularly good reading for us philosophers. He explains that we are not contrary to appearances, just leeching off society when we sit around reading books and having ideas. To the contrary, we are the highest achievers, the ones who realize human potential most fully. But a life of pure speculation was not Thales' style anyway, or so it would seem. He was no detached contemplator, more of an all-purpose wise man. In fact, he was named as one of the so-called 7 sages of the early period of Greece. Another one of the 7, whose name is still remembered nowadays, is Solon, who set down many of the laws governing Athens. Thales' political engagement is best shown by a report that he urged a political union between all the Ionian cities so that they could resist their neighbors to the east, a policy which, had it been adopted, might have enabled the cities to remain independent for longer than they did in fact. Only a few decades after the time of Thales, Miletus and other Ionian cities fell under the dominion of the Persians. More fun and also showing a practical turn of mind is the story about Thales and olive presses, supposedly. Thales' knowledge of weather conditions enabled him to predict a bumper crop of olives in the coming season. He went around and cornered the market on olive presses so that he could make a fortune when the predicted crop came in and everyone needed to turn their olives into oil. On the other hand, Plato tells a story about Thales walking along looking at the sky and falling into a well because he isn't watching where he's going. Conveniently for the anecdote, there's a servant woman on hand to laugh at him, underscoring the point that philosophers don't notice the world at their feet because they're so busy looking at the sky. Since I myself am capable of smashing my toe into a stone step while trying to go into a house and read a book at the same time, I have a lot of sympathy for the Thales who fell down a well. But the evidence we have suggests we should instead imagine Thales as a well-rounded fellow, engaged with the world around him, as well as with the nature of the world as a whole. What kind of evidence do we have about him then? Thales and the other earliest Greek thinkers are called the pre-Socratics, the ones who lived before Socrates, even though, as we'll see, some so-called pre-Socratics actually lived at about the same time as Socrates. For this reason, and because it seems a bit rude to label these thinkers with reference to a future philosopher, I have titled this section of the book, Early Greek Philosophy. This expression seems to be gaining ground in scholarly works on the subject. Still, for ease of expression, I'll mostly use the still common phrase pre-Socratics to refer to the early Greek thinkers. For all of these figures, our knowledge is really based on nothing more than tantalizing scraps. People who work in the field call these scraps fragments. But even this makes the situation sound better than it usually is. What we've actually got is works by later ancient authors, or rather copies of works by later ancient authors, who tell us something about, say, Thales or Heraclitus. Occasionally we're in luck and they quote the early Greek thinkers verbatim, or even better, say they are going to quote them verbatim, and then do so. Some of these thinkers wrote in poetic verse, which has meter. This, of course, makes it much easier to tell if it is a direct quote. But often, what we've got is a much later thinker telling us what an early thinker thought, and we have to decide for ourselves how close this might be to the original wording or idea. Technically, these paraphrase reports are called testimonies rather than fragments, but it isn't always easy to tell the difference. Even if you are lucky enough to have an authentic fragment, it isn't necessarily obvious where the useful information starts and stops. One of our richest sources for the pre-Socratics is Aristotle, and he has a tendency to mix reports of what they thought with educated guesses about what else they must have thought, and why they thought what they thought. Furthermore, he's almost always forcing the pre-Socratics into the framework of his own theories, trying to make his predecessors look like they were groping towards the sublime insights of Aristotle himself. Some of what I've already mentioned shows the problems we're facing here. That story about falling in the well is a nice story, but maybe it's a little too nice. It sounds more like an amusing anecdote that's been assigned to Thales because he's a famous philosopher, the way witty remarks get ascribed to Oscar Wilde or Dorothy Parker, even though they didn't say them. In the case of Thales, the problem is particularly difficult, and I should admit before we go any further that almost nothing can be said about him for sure, but we'll do the best with what we've got. Some of the things I've already mentioned give flavor of one major dimension of his achievement. He was a scientist in something like the sense we would use the term. If we know anything about him for certain, it's that he was interested in astronomy. The story about the olive presses also shows that Thales had expertise in what we would call the physical sciences, or at least had a reputation for having that expertise. This is confirmed by other evidence. There's a story about him diverting a river into two branches so that it would be possible to cross it, because each of the two branches would be shallower than the single river. And although Thales may in fact have written nothing at all, some sources tell us that he did write a book about navigation at sea. All this is typical of early Greek philosophy, and in fact of philosophy right up until the modern period. As I mentioned in the preface, the tendency to separate philosophy from what we call science is a recent phenomenon, and certainly not one most Greek thinkers would have recognized. So this is one reason to say that Thales was the first philosopher. He was the first person to gain a reputation for the sort of independent analysis of nature we describe as scientific. For this reason, it's traditional to describe Thales and the other pre-Socratics as being rational, as opposed to the presumably irrational culture that went before them. But this is not a very useful way of looking at it. The main texts we have to illustrate Greek cultural beliefs before the time of Thales are the works of Homer and Hesiod. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey would in fact have been already for the pre-Socratics the greatest touchstones of Greek culture. In the ancient Greek world, they played the sort of role that the Bible did in medieval Europe, and that Shakespeare does for us, or used to, when people knew their Shakespeare. Clearly, the Iliad and Odyssey aren't philosophical texts, but neither is Homer irrational. The Iliad is, among other things, a reflection on the sources and consequences of, as it says in the first line, the wrath of Achilles. Indeed, you could argue that Homer has a greater insight into cause and effect in the human sphere than most pre-Socratics have into the cause and effect of the world around us. The fact that Homer often invokes the agency of a god or goddess to explain what is happening in the Trojan War, or Odysseus' long voyage home only counts as irrational if you think it's irrational to believe in the gods. Closer to the aim of pre-Socratic philosophy is Hesiod's Theogony, a poem setting out stories about the origins and natures of the gods, probably in part by collecting previous material. Some of this looks more or less explicitly cosmological, in a way that is not too distant from the kind of pre-Socratic cosmology we'll be talking about over the coming chapters. Sure, Hesiod equates his gods and goddesses to his cosmological principles. The Greek word Oranos means heaven, and is also the name of a god in Hesiod, for instance. But again, it's hard to make a good case for Hesiod being irrational. He's laying out a theology, and that theology is at least meant to be consistent and explain something or even explain everything. If you think theology can't be rational, just wait until we get to Aquinas. I think a better way of understanding the pre-Socratics would be to say that their views were, at least implicitly, grounded in arguments. This, to me, is the difference between early Greek philosophy and other early Greek cultural productions. We mostly have too little evidence about Thales to reconstruct the arguments that gave rise to his views, but Aristotle was probably right to try to reconstruct arguments of some sort or another. We can follow his example by turning finally to Thales' few attested philosophical claims. The best known is that he thought water was really, really important. It's a little unclear, unfortunately, in what way exactly he thought water was important. Aristotle tells us that Thales believed the world floats upon water, like a piece of wood, section 84. Here we seem to have a cosmological view that would be at home in a non-philosophical religious or theological tradition. The heaven, as even Homer says, is like a dome above us, and the world is a disk floating upon the sea under that dome. However, Aristotle tells us something else about Thales and water. He thought that water was a cosmic principle. Here Thales may well have been anticipating arguments that would be made by his immediate successors. As we'll see very soon, various pre-Socratics thought that the materials the world is made of were formed out of the condensation or rarefaction of other materials. So perhaps Thales, observing the importance of water for life in plants, animals, and humans, or the earthy residue left after water evaporates into air, decided that in the first instance, everything comes from water. Now probably you are not thinking, my God, he's right, everything does come from water. But if Thales got to his water principle in this kind of way, then at least it would show him giving a novel explanation of the cosmos, and using a process of argument to get to that explanation. Whether, as Aristotle implies, Thales also thought everything is literally made of water seems more doubtful, section 85. To think this, he would have to have believed that something like rock, which seems eminently dry and solid, in fact consisted of water. And there is no reason to believe he attempted such an account, though an explanation like this would be given not much later by another philosopher from the same city, Anaximenes. Another philosophical claim ascribed to Thales is that a magnet has a soul, and so does amber. When you rub amber, it attracts things just as a magnet does. This is due to static electricity. What sense can we make of this? Well, Aristotle tells us about Thales and the magnet in the process of asserting that all philosophers associate soul with motion. Aristotle may be right to say that Thales was already onto this point. There must be soul in a magnet, otherwise it could not initiate the motion that pulls it and a piece of iron towards one another. Aristotle tells us also that, according to Thales, all things are full of gods. This is a classic bit of pre-Socratic philosophy in the form of a catchphrase. As we'll see, Heraclitus is the master at this style of philosophy. But let's take seriously the claim that all things are full of gods by putting it together with the other idea about magnets. What you get is a nice little argument which would go something like this. Everything is full of gods, and I'll show you this using the example of the magnet. It seems to be lifeless, but it must have soul because it can initiate motion. So by extension, you should at least be open to the idea that everything has soul, which is divine. That's obviously doing a lot of Thales' work for him by combining two fragments and filling in the gaps. But that, as I hope you'll come to agree over the following chapters, is what makes the pre-Socratics so much fun.